want to hold anything up. I'm Bob Megna, president of the Rockefeller Institute of Government. I'd like to welcome everyone here today. This is a great turnout for a great event. And I'm going to let the Chancellor of the SUNY system give some introductory remarks that he recorded. He had an emergency situation up at Potsdam today that he's dealing with. But I want to thank the staff at Rockefeller, especially Brian Backstrom, who I think many of you know, and Rachel Frisella and Heather Stone, who set up and did all the setup for this event. So I'd just like to thank them, but without further ado, let's turn it over to the Chancellor.
First, thank you for having me today. The topic of this event is so important, and the possibilities that widespread adoption of science of reading principles could open up are so exciting that I can't imagine anything I'd rather be talking about. And I think what's most exciting about science of reading, and what seems to separate it from other learning theories, is that we know it works. We know. So much about education can seem mired in uncertainty. Proof of efficacy is hard to come by, and pedagogical trends can be highly political and even seem deeply whimsical. For every study that says a method works, someone comes up with a study that says it doesn't. But I don't believe that uncertainty exists with science of reading. The data is clear. We know it works. The research is emphatic on the keys to early literacy instruction. Phonics and word recognition, fluency, vocabulary, oral language comprehension, and text comprehension, deep background knowledge. This is broadly true for most students, and is particularly true of students who deal with reading barriers like dyslexia. Phonics are absolutely crucial for such students, and reading instruction methods that don't incorporate them won't work for those children or the adults they become. What's more, learning to read fluently early on is the key to academic success in nearly every subject later on. From pre-K through third grade, students should be learning to read, but thereafter they will be reading to learn. Students cannot easily perform science experiments, complete math word problems, or absorb drama scripts if they cannot read fluently. 75% of children who are behind in reading in third grade will never catch up. That's a statistic that has taken on increased meaning in the wake of COVID. Literacy gaps have been exacerbated by disruptions to students' school lives and in their home lives. Absent catch-up measures rooted in the science of reading, their odds are not good. But with proper evidence-based instruction and interventions that reflect the urgency of the situation, a return to on-grade level proficiency is not just a possible outcome, it's the expected one. The recent and increasing acceptance of science of reading tactics holds lessons for us. Change should have come faster, should still be coming faster. Entrenched methods, when they did not work as well, it works, and less loyalty to teaching methods and traditions that are employed more out of habit and loyalty than efficacy. The 8 months since I began in my role as Chancellor of the State University of New York have been a whirlwind. I visited all 64 campuses in a semester, met literally thousands of people, absorbed a massive amount of information, or tried to, and existed in a state of constant wonder and surprise and awe of the great work happening across SUNY. And again, I was reminded what a huge role SUNY plays in training educators, and what huge response each of our mission and has been since our founding 75 years ago. And in many cases, since the founding of our individual campuses long before. And now the science of reading has found a home base at SUNY New Paltz, where teacher education has been a core offering for nearly 2 centuries, and almost 2,000 teachers have graduated in just the past 5 years. In June, SUNY New Paltz received a $6.37 million donation from the IBIS Group to establish the Science of Reading Center of Excellence on campus. The IBIS Group seeks to ensure that students have access to evidence-based instructional methods to master grade-level reading by the end of the first grade. The center will offer a Science of Reading micro-credential for New York teachers and add an endowed professorship. The micro-credential will be taught online, and the first 5,000 teachers who take the course will receive a scholarship, thanks to the IBIS Group donation. It would be easy to think the science of reading is just another education idea to be pondered. And today's event is just another education symposium to participate in and then walk away from. But as someone whose professional life started as a teacher and who has never lost the love of assigning homework, I'd like to ask you to do a couple things when you leave here today, because I feel so strongly about this subject. First, I'd ask you to exhibit extreme urgency in support of science of reading and its tactics. Time is of the essence, and too often, that urgency is lacking. For current students who are not getting the reading tools they need to succeed, the time for change is now. Every semester or year that schools fail to adopt these proven teaching methods is going to mean children suffering from a lack of the most crucial and fundamental skills in education. And second, I'd ask you to be vocal. Where teachers or schools or districts or university schools of education are resisting the changes indicated by the data behind the science of reading, speak up, share that data, and advocate for change. National data shows that more than 1/3 of fourth grade students, over 1.3 million children, cannot read at a basic level. Those numbers are far worse for Black and Latino students, students with learning differences, and students living in poverty. And research suggests that over 90% of children could learn to read competently and on schedule via instructional methods informed by the science of reading. But recent data analysis by the National Council on Teacher Quality found that 2/3 of education programs fail to adequately address phonemic awareness, and 1/3 of programs do not have future teachers practice teaching using scientifically based reading instruction. And the study concluded better teacher preparation could cut reading failure rates by more than 2/3. That's an outcome worth training for and worth fighting for. And today I'm asking you to go out and fight for it for the students. Thank you.
It's terrible we have a chancellor about stuff like this. But let me quickly introduce Jeff Smink to you, who many of you probably already know. He lives in Rochester and is Deputy Director of the Education Trust, New York. Jeff brings more than 20 years of experience in national, state, and local education policy, working on issues affecting students from cradle to career. He has served as co-founder and vice president of policy at the National Summer Learning Association, as New York State director at the National Center on Time and Learning, for the Pennsylvania Department of Education and the Council of Chief State School Officers. More recently, Jeff led his own consulting practice focusing on the issue of literacy. So after lunch and having time to talk to everyone, I think it's time to dig in. So, Jeff, it's up to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks all for being here. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. So yeah, such a great turnout. As mentioned, I work with the Education Trust New York. I don't know if people are familiar with Ed Trust, but we are a statewide advocacy. Our job is to be a children and families, particularly those students of color, students from low-income backgrounds that have traditionally been so that's how we see our role. And so it's, as was mentioned, I've been sort of working on this issue for a while. Let's make sure there we go. And, you know, we're going to talk about the science today, and thanks to Chancellor King for those remarks. You know, complete alignment with what we're trying to do in New York, and I particularly appreciate the focus on urgency, because I think that's the one thing that's been missing. But as was mentioned, Rochester, as many of you know, Rochester is the home of Frederick Douglass, who, before he became a famous abolitionist, taught himself to read as a slave at a time when there were anti-literacy laws in our country. And this is just one of many, a wonderful panel of experts. But kind of want to do where are we? What does the landscape look like across the state? Hopefully you all saw a report that we released earlier this year that did just that. I'm going to start with just some facts or pieces that drive our work. So one, as I mentioned, reading is a civil and human right. It provides the foundation for full participation in society. As Chancellor King mentioned, third grade reading proficiency is the most important indicator of future student success. As he mentioned, we shift from that learning to read to reading to learn. And we know that when students are not reading by the end of third grade, it can lead to a host of negative outcomes. Increased dropout rate 8 times for places like Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse. When students drop out, whether that's the economy, whether it's public health, right? Whether that's the economy, whether it's public health, right? So I come back, I don't know if anyone here is from Rochester, but we, like a lot of other cities, are really struggling at a lot of levels. But one of the things we're struggling with is stolen cars. We lead the nation by, like, it's not even close. And I think we need to start seeing the line. These are predominantly 12, 13, 14-year-olds that are doing this and then driving around the city, which is problematic, as you can imagine. So there's a line. We've got to start to see, like, the connection between not being able to read. Would you want to go to school if you couldn't read? I wouldn't, right? And so there's a connection between all these things that I think we need to keep coming back to. This is more than the science. It's more than an academic issue. It's an everything issue, right? It impacts everything that we care about. So just a few more, some data points. So as Chancellor King mentioned, we know that with the right support, 95% of all students can learn to read. Here in New York State, we know that less than half of all third graders are reading proficiently, looking at the last round of state assessments. In Rochester, 9 out of 10 third graders are not reading proficiently. Think about that for a second. 95% of kids can read. We have the inverse happening in certain communities in this country. If we want to look at the NAEP scores, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, New York is 37th. 42% of fourth graders in New York are below basic. That's the lowest level you can score on the NAEP. That means you lack even partial mastery of foundational skills. And again, the Chancellor stole a lot of my data, but 2/3 of teacher prep programs are not aligned with evidence-based literacy instruction. So that's bad enough, but I think when we think about the fact that we haven't provided educators and students with evidence-based instruction that they deserve, it's frustrating, let's just put it that way. And that's where the science of reading comes in. So getting to the policy side of things a little bit, 45 states have passed legislation to get closer to the science of reading and align practice with the science of reading in schools. New York is one of the 5 states that has done little. It is one of the 5 states that has not passed legislation. State leaders until recently have been largely silent on this issue. Recently, there was a very strong presentation at the Board of Regents. I don't know if people got a chance to listen to that. I think the vision on that presentation was excellent in alignment with everything we care about. The problem, as we've seen, is that there's a big disconnect between that vision and what's happening in classrooms. In other words, that vision is not being implemented in way too many classrooms across the state. And so finally, to get to this issue, to really do something about it, we need more leadership, right? From our state leaders, from the governor, from the legislature, from our state education department, but also our district leaders, right? There's nothing preventing districts from doing any of the things that we're going to talk about today. So there's leadership there, and then as the Chancellor said, there's going to be a big advocacy push as well, right? People are ready to lead on this work. They're ready. I can say that having been around the state for the last year. So I'll talk more about we're going to be leading some advocacy efforts both at the state level and the district level. I think I'm going to skip over that. How many people are familiar with the science of reading broadly? Most of you. I'm going to skip over this because we have experts that are going to dig into this. I do want to do one slide just on kind of what the science of reading isn't, because I think there is some misinformation out there. So one is this idea that it's all about phonics instruction, right? That's the only piece of the science of reading. As the Chancellor mentioned, it's really the 5 pillars. It's fluency, it's comprehension, it's vocabulary, phonemic awareness. So that's phonics, just one piece of that. The other thing we hear a lot of, it's a one-size-fits-all approach. Again, not true. There's ways to differentiate instruction in the classroom. Some kids might need more phonics instruction. Some might need more fluency, vocabulary. There are strategies and ways to do that in the classroom. Importantly, it's not a curriculum. It's not an instructional approach, right? The science of reading is just that. It's the science about how kids learn how to read. And then the last two, and this came up in the Regents meeting, which I thought was really powerful, this idea that sometimes we think about reading, and particularly phonics instruction, as being really dry and taking the joy out of learning, and that it detracts from doing social emotional learning or culturally responsive learning. And really they go together, right? If a student is getting the right social emotional learning and they're in a culturally responsive environment, they're gonna end up reading better. And vice versa. If you're able to read, you're gonna feel a much greater sense of belonging in your school. So they go together. It's not an either or choice. And then lastly, this idea that it's only for schools. One of the things we're focused on at Trust is there's a huge role for parents, for early childhood providers, for summer and after school providers, for tutors, right? We can do, this is not just a school issue, it's a community-wide issue. Sorry, that's a little slow. Okay, so want to just run through the report that we released, I guess a few months ago, and just share some of the high-level findings. So one is this idea that, right, that the science of reading can help address. I wanted to start this work a year ago, is there was just a lack of urgency on this issue, right? Especially when you saw every year-long mixed methods approach. We did a poll of parents across the state. We did a survey of every district across the state to find out what instructional approach they were using. We did focus groups with teachers and students, and then interviews and research with folks and experts, both all over the state, but also all over the country. And so here's some of the findings, just high level. The first one really has nothing to do with the science of reading, right? Our expectations are too low for students, like full stop. If we're, again, coming back to a place like Rochester where 9 out of 10 kids are not reading proficiently, that's an expectation issue. And I think what's happened is it's been normalized. We've become numb to it as the data comes out every year. We've just become normalized to it, and that's not okay. So we know that 95% of kids can read. So we've got to fix this somehow. Part of our work is going to be to highlight best practices, show places that are doing it, because it is possible. But until people believe, until teachers believe, until mayors believe, we've got to change this belief system and believe that all kids can read, because they can. The second thing we found is, as we all know here, New York has a local control system of education, which leaves a lot of the instructional decisions to districts. What we found in our survey is that leads to a lot of districts using non-evidence-based instructional practices. Our survey, we only heard from maybe half the districts across the state, but by far the most popular curriculum being used was the Lucy Calkins Units of Study, which, is, you may have seen in the news, is recently separated parents from the top down, right? It has to be all the way through the system. We also saw a range of instructional approaches. So some districts doing both, structured literacy, balanced literacy, a combination of the two, which can be really confusing to kids. And then finally, as the Chancellor noted, a big challenge on the teacher preparation issue. I'll just leave that there. A couple more findings. So the parent poll that we did, parents overwhelmingly support the science of reading, although many are still learning about it. They want more transparency and support from schools. So the majority of parents had no idea how their school was teaching reading, what curriculum was being used, but 90% of them wanted to know that information. And a lot of the parents, overwhelming majority, wanted more support from schools on what they could do to help their kids at home to develop their reading skills. Our focus group with teachers, most saw the benefits of the science of reading, but we also interviewed middle school, high school teachers who were able to see the impact, right? Social studies teachers, science teachers who had kids who were struggling to read. So they see the impact all the way throughout the system. And then finally, there are bright spots, right? Districts that have embraced the science of reading. In Monroe County, we have a couple that have gotten some really strong outcomes. Actually, on the Regents presentation, I think they had Valley Stream, did a really strong presentation. They're getting great outcomes. So our job is going to be to highlight those, right? Both to build that awareness, build that belief system, but also how do they do it, right? And share some of those lessons. So in our report, we have a 10-point policy plan. I'm going to go really quickly through these, but the first one is we need to focus on evidence-based curriculum and instructional resources, right? We can't do any of these things if we have districts that are still using curricula or resources proven not to work. I think there's a lot of ways we can get at that. Hopefully in the discussion, we can have that discussion. Connecticut our neighbor to the east mandated the use of certain curricula, evidence-based curricula. Massachusetts, our other neighbor to the east, tried to incentivize it. I think there's ways to get around the local control issue, but we have to be creative and think about that. Teacher prep, there's a lot there. I'm not gonna go into all the details we have. I know that we have partners here that are working on this issue, but that's gotta be reformed. It's gotta be more aligned with the science of reading, right? Teachers who are never trained, it's not their fault if they're not trained how to do this work. So we've gotta fix that. Progress monitoring, 3rd grade is too late to get assessment results. It's too late. So we need to do a better job of progress monitoring starting in kindergarten, if not in pre-kindergarten, to get a sense of where kids are. As I said, if teachers haven't been trained, they're gonna need a lot of coaching, a lot of professional development. That's gotta be a huge piece of this. It's gotta be curriculum aligned. It's gotta be relevant. This public reporting piece is important. So when we did our report, we had to survey the districts. The state doesn't collect that information. It's very difficult to find for parents. So I wanna make sure that parents can find this information when they need it, right? So that's a big piece of it. And then 6, 7, and 8 are all similar in this idea of kind of a wraparound approach. So there's a huge role for families, as simple as talking more with their kids during those first few years, expanded learning opportunities, so summer, after school, tutoring, that type of thing. And we're really envisioning this as a birth to 8 approach, right? We can't wait till kindergarten to start this work. We need to give kids those skills before they get to the kindergarten door. And then the last 2, we think there's a real need too for blended learning and technology. As the Chancellor mentioned, the pandemic has set kids way behind. I read a study where the average 5th grade class now has 7 different grade levels in it. So we need to give teachers help in differentiating that instruction, right? Because it's hard to do, and I think there's a role for technology to help do that. And then finally, just as a teaser, we need a statewide campaign to really do all this work. Whoops, sorry, wrong way. So as the next steps is we are at Ed Trust New York in the process of building what we're calling a campaign for early literacy. That's gonna focus, number 1, on building awareness, right? Making sure that everyone knows about this information, because believe it or not, a lot of folks just don't even know that it's out there, or how big of a challenge, how big of a problem we're facing across the state. And then there's gonna be an advocacy piece, right? We're not gonna be the only ones focusing on this. And as I said, we've already got maybe 30 partners across the state, and I think we're gonna have a lot more. As I said, people are ready for action on this. We're past the report phase, it's time for action. And then lastly, we envision, if and when the policy changes are made, really supporting on the implementation side and sharing those best practices and going into depth on some of the key areas that are needed. So just finishing up, if folks do wanna learn more about the science of reading, how many people have listened to the Sold a Story podcast? Great. How many people have seen the Right to Read documentary? Awesome. So yeah, those are 2 great ways to introduce the topic. We've used them all over the state. It's a great way to just get people oriented, and then we've done like panel discussions afterwards, so would highly recommend that strategy. We have on our website a whole host of resources. And on the advocacy front, really we're really focused on getting parents and nonprofits and everyone that cares about this issue, arming them, with data and with facts to get their school districts to align with the science of reading, as well as at the state level. So I think my last slide, I'll try to end on a positive note, because I know there's a lot of sort of negative data in there, but this is a solvable crisis. As the Chancellor said, we know what to do. One of the advantages, I think, of New York being late to this party is that we can learn from the 45 other states that have passed legislation. So we can learn. We don't have to reinvent the wheel by any stretch. But it's got to be a state and community-wide effort. Everyone needs to be on board. We need mayors on board. We need parents on board. We need our state legislators on board. We need the governor on board. We need everybody. We're going to be advocating at the state and local level with our partners. And then just to close again on a positive note, let's just imagine for a second, think of your community, your school system, our state, what it would look like if we went from less than half of kids reading, much worse in some places, to 95% of kids reading. What that impact would be on your school system, on your community 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So keep that in the back of your mind as why we're doing this work, right? This is not just an academic issue. It's much more than that. So with that, I think I'm going to stop. And what's next? So we're going to introduce our panelists. And then I think if people we'll have plenty of time for questions, so please keep those questions ready for us. So our first panelist is going to be Dr. Benjamin Powers. Dr. Powers is the director of the Global Literacy Hub at the Yale Child Study Center and is a senior scientist with the Haskins Laboratories, also at Yale. He is a practitioner, researcher, and advocate who works with students with dyslexia and ADHD, including serving as the executive director of the Southport School and CoLab, a thought leader in the education of students with language-based learning differences. Some of Dr. Powers' recent research focuses on the self-esteem and self-efficacy perceptions of adolescents with dyslexia and ADHD to understand the impact personal level variables have on social emotional well-being and career intentions. And so Dr. Powers is going to tell us more about what's the science behind the science of reading. So Dr. Powers. Oh.
Well, thank you so much. And I'd like to take a moment to thank the Rockefeller Institute of Government for having us here today. It's really exciting. I think one of the things, hearing Chancellor King's remarks, in a way, he kind of did my job. He just so articulately talked about, this is science that we know. And there's no one science of reading. That's really important to understand. There's an ongoing science that really needs to inform how we're instructing kids in the classroom. And so it's only through partnership that that's going to be able to happen. And that's what's so inspiring in an event like today, is to see so many different types of partners coming together to bridge this gap that we have. And so I just want to talk for a moment about the Global Literacy Hub at the Yale Child Study Center, because we have really three key things that we're trying to do. Haskins Labs is the epicenter of spoken and written research. It's been the epicenter of spoken and written research for decades. And it's an international consortium of researchers who really think about how we can advance our knowledge or understanding of spoken and written language acquisition. They do basic science. And the hub really was an outgrowth of Haskins. And the hub's job is to take that basic science and really translate it so that we can actually impact change in places like classrooms. And so one of our associate directors, Dr. Jay Russell's here with us today as well, and our other associate director, Dr. Maureen Lovett, could not be here with us today. But our job is really to build on the legacy of those contributions from Haskins Labs to make that impact. And you can see this is just an example of some of the people who are working on this research and this translational impact. People like Dr. Mark Seidenberg, who wrote Language at the Speed of Sight, people like Dr. Marianne Wolf, people like Dr. Ken Pugh, who's the president of Haskins Labs. So it's really an international consortium of researchers. And this is the power of partnership. By working collaboratively with people at different universities all across the globe, we can really advance and make exponential impact in the way that we're educating students. So we've talked about the NAEP scores. I just want to highlight this. This is so critical to understand. When we look at the NAEP scores, what we're really looking to see is how many students are meeting proficient benchmarks. And when we look at 2022, we're looking at 33% of kids in this country are either meeting or exceeding proficient benchmarks. 1 out of 3. Of course, Chancellor King and Jeff have covered this afternoon, but one thing that we don't talk a lot about with NAEP scores is how students perceive their ability, and that's really important. And so, interestingly, if you look at 2019, we've got 35% meeting proficient benchmarks. 2022, we've got 33% meeting proficiency benchmarks. Lo and behold, what do the kids think? About 1/3 of students feel like they are able to understand what they're reading. So this is one of the last questions on the NAEP. And so to me, that's really telling. It's not just that we're not meeting benchmarks in our communities, in our schools, but the kids know this. The students understand this. And every student, or most students, arrive at school really primed to learn. And when we have that transition from reading to learn to learning to read, the wheels really fall off for our kids. So why is this? Why are we struggling so much with reading? Well, we've got a number of reasons. It's not one thing. Just like there's no one science of reading, there's no one reason we're struggling with reading. We've talked about a little of the underlying reasons already. We've talked about things like instructional models, curriculum, teacher knowledge, dosage. How much instruction are we giving to kids? How much time are we allocating during the school day for literacy instruction? We've got things like environmental factors, the education status of caregivers in the home, access to books, trauma and stress. We have researchers like Augusta Buchweitz who've done amazing research thinking about the impact of things like trauma in communities and how that impacts resiliency in kids and their ability to decode the written word. We've got learner profiles. We've talked about things like dyslexia. We've got auditory processing disorder. We've got things like attentional issues like ADHD, anxiety. Dr. Sharon Vaughn and Dr. Amy Grills are doing one of the first federally funded studies on the bidirectional nature and between anxiety and reading. What we know is that data from their study almost right away was so clear that students who are struggling to read are going to have anxiety, and students who have anxiety are going to struggle with reading. Again, it's not a surprise, but now we're able to validate this. So that is happening. And what do we know about anxiety? It's increasing rampantly. We're seeing more and more anxiety in our learners. And so this problem is not going to get easier. It's why now is the time to impact and affect change. We also have challenges with the culture of science versus the culture of education. A lot of the research that I'm going to talk about today all happens, or mostly happens, in schools of psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience. It's all happening in schools of psychology. Whereas where are teachers being prepared? In schools of education. And there's not the bidirectional communication that needs to be happening in those spaces. It's not really happening today. And so the information from what's happening in cognitive and neuroscience domains, genetics research, is not necessarily being translated into the schools of ed. And of course, that's not getting to our teachers. So that's really, really important. Another key issue, though, for us as English language speakers is orthography, our writing system. And if you think about our orthography, we have what is called a very deep orthography, meaning that, as many of you may know, we don't have a direct sound-symbol relationship in the English language. We have 26 letters that generate 44 different phonemes. And so unlike a language like Finnish, where Finnish is has a much shallower orthography, meaning even though I lived in Finland, I don't speak Finnish, but I can decode Finnish because most of Finnish is highly decodable. Their vowels are, highly regular, whereas in English, we have, all the different ways to spell all the long vowel sounds. And so this makes it very, very challenging. So it's a combination of all of these things that has made reading and literacy acquisition very challenging, and more challenging in an English-speaking country like ours. So it's really important. The other big piece is we are teaching kids to learn to read really K2. That's been a shift. It used to be really kind of K3. Now it's even earlier, K2. And this is the type of language that we're putting in front of our kids early on. It's a lot of old English words. It's a lot of words that are, either one syllable or short words. I won dribble at Jimmy Fargo's birthday party. All the other guys got to take home goldfish in little plastic bags. Okay, we can get a lot of kids who might be able to tackle this type of text early on, but not be proficient readers. Because what happens in 4th grade? What are kids starting to work with? Textbooks. What's the language of textbooks? It's highly influenced by Latin and Greek word parts. And this is what it looks like. These are all words pulled from approved textbooks in the United States, in the US. These are all highly, multisyllabic words that are highly influenced by Latin and Greek word parts. So now we are taking kids who are being, working in classrooms where when they're not getting the science of reading, they're being exposed to language, mostly Old English words. There's a high likelihood that they're coming into contact with Old English texts. And then all of a sudden, by the time they hit 4th grade, 3rd or 4th grade, when they're having to go from learning to read to reading to learn, the text that they're encountering, they've not seen before. And they do not have adequate strategies to be able to tackle this. A lot of the focus when we talk about the science of reading tends to be on that K2 part, where we're talking about decoding and phonics. And when you talk to school systems across the country, what they also talk about is the deficit they begin to see when kids hit the later years of elementary school. They can't access the text, they don't have the tools, they don't have the vocabulary. All of these words up here are highly decodable words. In fact, the older our kids get, the more likely the words in front of them are highly decodable. So when we hear this, pushback against things like phonics instruction because English is irregular, and it is, English is an irregular language, but statistically, It is actually much more regular than we think it is. And the more advanced the vocabulary, the more advanced the type of text in front of our kids, the more important the science of reading is. So we talked about some of the background factors of why literacy acquisition is challenging. This is a slide actually from one of our colleagues, Fumiko Huff, who is now at UConn and runs the Brain Lens Lab. But it's a number of different factors. We talk about developmental things. We talk about neurobiology. We talk about the culture and our writing system, that orthography I just mentioned. We talk about environment and the way, and compensation, and we talk about mood, motivation, and resilience. There are so many factors that impact our students. It's why, in fact, the science of reading alone isn't going to solve this problem. There are other factors we have to think about too, and how our kids are coming into school and being supported through their process of acquiring literacy. But the science of reading has to be a core foundation of this because we know it works. We have science that shows that. And so some of these other things are challenging too, but if we know we have something that works and we can put that in place as our foundation, it's going to make then tackling these other pieces adding on so that we can increase that efficacy. All right, so I want you to think about this for a second. You take a word like retractable, okay, so this is a word that a student is likely not going to be exposed to K-3, right? And they come into textbook language, they're toward the end of elementary school, and they read a word like retractable. There is a lot going on in this word. How many letters does retractable have? 11, okay? How many phonemes does this word have? You don't have to answer, but I'll give you a second to think about it. 10, okay, there's 10 phonemes. Now, a phoneme, if you don't know, a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound, okay? Smallest unit of sound. How many syllables does this word have? Retractable, 4 syllables, right? Now, how many morphemes? A morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning, okay? There are 3 morphemes in the word retractable. Here's what's interesting. We go from the end of the word back. So everybody, I think, probably understands able means the ability to. Tract. Does anybody know what tract means? Yeah, you're doing pull, right? Pull or drag. That's why a tractor actually drags something behind it. So tract means pull or to drag, and means, again, if you can like revisit something. So something that's retractable is something we can pull again and again, like a blind is retractable, right? There's a lot going on in this word. That's a lot of expectation we're putting on kids without giving them any code or any type of resources to actually make meaning of this. And all of this is covered in the science of reading. When we work with students based on the science of reading, what it allows them to do is generate and develop knowledge around these things so that they can encounter a word like retractable, even if they've never seen it before in their lives, be able to decode it, be able to understand what meaning might be behind it, even if they don't know all those word parts. Then they can begin to unlock and comprehend, because of course that's the end goal of reading. So it's really important that we follow science. I was actually on my way to work one day, and I saw this Rolls Royce in front of me, and my parents had always told me there was no money in science, and this may have proved them wrong. I haven't seen it yet, but it's coming, I'm sure. And then the upper left-hand corner, that's Will Baker. Will was the founder and president of the Dyslexia Association. Will was my best friend and passed away last year. He is one of the most dyslexic people I have ever met in my life. And he started the Dyslexia Foundation and created the first brain bank in the United States up at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center with people like Dr. Albert Galaberta. And so why that was so important, Will used to fly around the country with those little igloo coolers, right? And when somebody with dyslexia passed away and was willing to donate their brain, he would literally pick up the brain, fly back to Boston, and they would literally do dissections of the brain so we can see there are brain level differences in somebody. There's a lot of reasons for that too. I think we're probably aware of a number of those. Part of it is, though, the translation of science, not just from schools of psychology to schools of ed, but also out into the public domain, takes a long time. And this is an infographic developed by Emily Solari and colleagues as part of parasitic to speech. What does that mean? We have a growing understanding and awareness of the importance of things like oral language and why we need oral language to be in place to be able to help kids be proficient readers. And when we start teaching reading to kids, we were never designed to read. We were designed for oral language. We were never designed to read. And so reading has to take over some of the oral language pathways. And what we see, and this is across all languages, we see a convergence of print and speech in brain. Again, we can see this. There is no denying this. We can literally see this in brain when we're doing fMRI studies at a place like Haskins. And so it's critically important to understand. And that's really what's led us to the science of reading. This whole notion that, our science of reading, and I should mention, I know people are taking pictures, you're welcome to do that, but there's a QR code at the end so you can get all these slides if you want them. So learning reads to build on our cognitive, linguistic, and social skills that have developed from the earliest age. Even though we might start reading in kindergarten and schools, it's really starting in utero, believe it or not. It's exposure to language in utero that starts to prime our oral language pathways. But what do we know is important to be a successful reader? We need decoding. We talk about phonics a lot. And spoiler alert, the reason we talk about phonics so much is because when we look at the big five, it's the easiest part to teach in a way. Phonics is much easier to teach. But that's that whole notion of the alphabetic principle. We need to link letters and sounds. And we've known this for a long time too. We have our big five, right? We've got phonemic awareness, phonics, we've got fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And again, what's important to understand about this, like fluency is a characteristic of reading. Fluency is our rate, our accuracy, our prosody. It's hard to teach fluency. It's much easier to teach phonics. And of course, phonics is a really important part of the beginning block of reading. But a true science of reading approach is going to encompass all of these different pieces. I just have a little note up here, the difference between phonemic awareness and phonics. This gets confusing for people, especially a lot of teachers get confused by this. Phonics is really thinking about linking sounds and letters. Phonemic awareness is that understanding of the smallest units of sound, of phonemes. And again, this came out of Haskins in the 70s. That's Al Liberman right there. It was phonics, the letters. What do we know about stronger beginning readers? They can do certain things like decide whether two words rhyme. They can count the number of syllables in words. They can identify whether two words end with the same sound. Really important to know, we can actually screen kids early. We know what signs we're looking for early. So not only do we know what to be doing in the classroom, we can also be looking at risk factors very, very early on to be able to identify whether a kid might be at risk for reading failure and therefore need more of that dosage up front. And we've got two ways that, when we think about phonics, we've got two ways we can decode a word. We can either use sight words, there's a lot of talk about sight word recognition, or we can use decoding. This is the difference between teaching a person to fish versus feeding them for a day. If you think about it, not only does science support this, it just makes sense. We can only memorize so many words, right? We can only learn so many words. If we teach kids tools to access the printed word, we're going to have much greater outcomes. And we've seen this not just through numerous studies that have taken place over decades, but also through models like models that Mark Seidenberg and colleagues have built, where they've used things like machine learning. We can train train like through machine learning and show that the orthography phonology, so taking the orthography, the decoding piece, and linking it to phonology, the sounds, is a much more efficient pathway than going from orthography to semantics. What happens as we learn to read, this whole notion of statistical learning, is that early on we really rely on that orthography phonology. We need that. But we also divide our labor in our brain, that semantics, the meaning behind it, also starts to help influence our understanding of words. But teaching, which is basically what's been done for so many years, teaching using an orthography semantic pathway is completely inefficient. We know there's just decades of research behind this. We need an orthography phonology pathway to really help our kids read. And Stanislaus Dehaene, he's done a lot of work in things like the visual word form area. Again, our brains were never wired for print. We actually recycle parts of our brain, like the visual word form area, which was designed to be able to identify shapes or people's faces. We co-opt that part of the brain to link sounds to letters. So again, we have to literally retrain our brain. Our teachers are literally changing kids' brains when they teach them literacy acquisition. But the reading research is so clear. We need to consolidate the orthographic and phonological word parts. That has to happen for kids to be proficient readers. And we have to do it early. We know what the achievement gap looks like. We've talked about that. Chancellor King referenced that. And we know early reading research it just works better. We see greater normalization of reading scores and intervention. And again, all the research points to that we need decoding skills, not relying on things like looking at pictures or using things like the 3 queuing system. And there are a number of great resources that highlight this for us, things like NSOL, the National Center on Improving Literacy. We have actually a resource library of materials through partners that we have on our website, but there's a number of things we know we need to include. And there's a lot of resources out there that really boil this down and make this clear. And the last thing I want to say is what we really need to do is avoid lemons. This is my worksheet my daughter brought home from me 2 years ago. My daughter's now, she's in 3rd grade, she's 8 years old. In the old eagle eye, look at the pictures. We are doing a huge disservice to children when we ask them to lift their eyes off of the printed word and try to find something that is probably not even there. We're taxing their working memory. We're really making it much, much more challenging for them than we need to make it. What we can do instead is use really good research and evidence-based tools. And again, there's just a host of really great resources out there, like at NSOL, the Florida Center of Reading Research, just a ton of places we can go to avoid those lemons. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. There's the QR code if you want the slides. And again, I just want to thank the Rockefeller Institute for having us here. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Powers. Yes. So our next speaker is going, whoops. So our next speaker is going to be Dr. Shayla Mills, who is the Associate Provost of Academic Planning and Learning Innovation and the Dean of Graduate Professional and Interdisciplinary Studies and Continuing and Online Education at SUNY New Paltz. Dr. Mills has brought her expertise in working with new models for educating students to the formation and recent opening of a Science of Reading Fundamentals micro-credential at SUNY New Paltz. So Dr. Mills, please tell us more about the need that SUNY has seen for teachers trained in the science of reading, as well as the effort that New Paltz is now making on this issue.
There we are. All right, good. Well, my thanks as well. I'll join others in thanking the Rockefeller Institute for having us all here today, and to my fellow panelists for all of your contributions. And my thanks to Chancellor King for that terrific shout out to SUNY New Paltz, but also for his commitment to literacy, as well as his support for our campus in establishing our new Center for the Science of Reading Excellence. I'm delighted to talk to you all today about what we're doing, and just to be clear, as my introduction shares, I'm not an expert, and panelists here today are. In my role as an administrator at SUNY New Paltz, I have been working with the faculty, the instructional design team, and with that we are offering. And I'm here to talk to you about that, what we're doing, and why the right to read is a human right, because it is associated with greater human flourishing. And as we've already been talking about today, it is something that we can address. So as other panelists have already begun to explain, and you'll hear more from others, we have decades of research that demonstrate that the efficacy of science-based approaches to teaching reading make a difference. Many states and the District of Columbia have passed laws and policies related to reading instruction. And this summer, as we have seen in extensive reports in news media outlets, and as I know Jason will be sharing soon, that movement has reached our New York City public schools. So public investment and public policy are certainly tools through which we can better support our children, and higher education has a really important role to play. Higher education's research and scholarship contributes to the body of scientific knowledge. Higher education classrooms prepare the next generation of teachers, and higher education can provide professional development and training to support current teachers in their work. Our institution's mission is to provide an excellent education to our students that prepares them for lifelong learning and success, and our mission also requires us to be a clear value to the citizens of New York. And our work in the science of reading is one way we're living out that mission, to bring conditions through community engagement that improve New York State, both for our school teachers and for our school children. Our president, Darrell Wheeler, has endorsed this effort on the part of our Higher education mission to use our scholarly research to also inform pedagogical practice for teachers. And he does that recognizing, as the Chancellor mentioned, our nearly 2 centuries of history as an institution that's committed to literacy, and well over 100 years as an institution that has been committed to teaching teachers. So if you don't know much about the history of SUNY New Paltz, we began in 1828 as a classical school, which among other things taught literacy, taught reading. In 1885, we became a normal school that was focused on preparing teachers. In 1938, we became the State Teachers College at New Paltz, expanding our commitment to preparing teachers by offering a 4-year degree. In 1948, we joined the SUNY system, and just this past year, we became a university within that system. We have both undergraduate and graduate degrees that lead to initial and professional certification in early childhood, and adolescent education. Our MSN in literacy is one of our largest graduate programs on our campus. And in fact, of our nearly 60 graduate programs, most of our programs are in the School of Education, master's degrees and certificates of advanced study. So training teachers is deep in the history of our institution, and a point of pride to us, both in terms of our undergraduate and graduate programming. So we're well suited to deliver on the promise of educational opportunity at SUNY New Paltz and to be a leader in this important work in teaching our children to read. We know that connecting the theory and the pedagogical practice in P through 12 classrooms, that by doing that, we can be part of the solution and to address the state and the national. Work in this area is in 2 parts. As you've already heard, we are in the process of creating our Science of Reading Center for Excellence, and many thanks to the IBIS Group and their generous donation to us. The center will have an endowed professorship. It will focus on cutting-edge research and teaching in the science of reading. And we expect to launch that center next year in the fall of '24. So that is very much a work in progress for us right now. What we have launched just last week is our micro-credential in the Science of Reading Fundamentals and its related CTLE credits. Our micro-credential is part of a larger initiative in SUNY system, an initiative that is aimed at bringing micro-credentials as high-quality, stackable, in-demand micro-credentials to New York State residents. And this particular non-credit-bearing micro-credential is part of that work, providing training in these fundamentals of the science of reading. Not only can the participants get that micro-credential, but as I said, it does also lead to 35 CTLE credits. So we're really pleased to bring not just scholars in Massachusetts, and she continues as a who has 2 master's in New Paltz, currently working on her education, literacy instruction, and dyslexia at the University of Florida, and to joining specialized reading teacher, a literacy coach, and a team leader. Like Dr. Lord, she is letters trained, and she's been an adjunct in our literacy program at SUNY New Paltz, literacy assessments, recognizing and applying tailored science of reading components in P through 12 classroom settings, and building on science of reading, a literacy coach, and a team leader. Like Dr. Lord, she is letters trained, and she's been an adjunct. And the structure is that each of these modules takes 5 to 10 hours for someone to complete. It progresses through learning about the science of reading, applying new science of reading knowledge to guided practice, and then taking that back to the classroom to apply that knowledge independently. We're delivering the micro-credential as a curriculum agnostic, as it launched last week, a guided bridge to practice discussion forum. Participants can join with one another to talk about micro-credential, and that will be joined with a live session with a faculty member who will help them make that bridge to practice. We'll also be having periodic webinars that to join to hear from a field. Students will be assessed or are being assessed through both formative self-assessment and end of module summative assessments. Design the micro-credential with classroom teachers in mind. Those aren't the who might benefit from this, and for any grade level, not just for the early grades. We do believe it will also be helpful to principals, superintendents, and other school leaders, and we are seeing enrollments already from those other individuals. Anyone who might feel like they need policymakers, and we've already begun to reach out to educational partners like BOCES and some members of our panel to give us advice and insights. And very happy to be able to participate today in the panel. We are very excited about our center, about our micro-credential, and our hope that we can help be part of making a difference for school children in the state of New York and beyond.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Mills. Thank you. So just a reminder, we are going to have a discussion Q&A after, so get your questions ready. So our next speaker is Dr. John Russell. Dr. Russell is the Special Projects Advisor to and former Executive Director of the Windward Institute, whose mission is to increase childhood literacy by disrupting the status quo in education. Before becoming Executive Director at Windward, Dr. Russell served for more than a decade as head of the Windward School, which is an independent co-ed day school for children with language-based learning disabilities. An associate director of the Haskins Global Literacy Hub at Yale, an interdisciplinary to improve language and literacy. Some of the results, seen firsthand the results of
You're probably familiar with it. Ode on a distant prospect of Eton College. I'm not going to read the whole poem, but I am going to read the last line because I think your discussion, "'Tis bliss, 'tis folly to be wise," and I hope. And since my good colleague Dr. Powers had a brain, September 19th of 1881, he was shot by someone that was described as a deranged lawyer, which I thought was somewhat repetitious. A gentleman by the name of Guteau, and everybody who's ever been to Washington, D.C. in the summertime knows it's a good idea to get out of there as quickly as possible and go to the station ready to go to the train station with a mortal, well, it wasn't mortal at the time, but with this gunshot wound to his side, Dr. Will Bliss. Decided that because of his training, and you'll see why this, he was taught that you had to remove the bullet above all else. Cover your ears. These Pasteur and Koch had promulgated the germ theory of disease. Lister had already said do this, like we know the science of reading, but they didn't. Long story short, things didn't change in medicine until 1910, when there was a national panel formed, partly in response to Garfield's death, but it was called the Flexner Report, and it eliminated proprietary medical schools. We heard covering public school superintendent. I was a superintendent for 11 years, and then I went to Windward, where my true education began. So, coming both between the medical knowledge that Dr. Bliss obviously needed but didn't have, and the knowledge our teachers need and don't have, and I want to emphasize this, through no fault of their own. I believe that teachers go into the profession with the absolute passion to help kids. They work hard, they're dedicated, but they're shortchanged in their preparation, as we've heard several times, though I won't harp on this. This is a passage from Mark Seidenberg's book that Dr. Powers referred to, Language at the Speed of Sight. And I'm just going to read the first sentence because it speaks. The gulf between science and education has been harmful, like the gulf between medical knowledge and what Dr. Bliss did. A look at the science reveals that methods commonly used to teach children are inconsistent with the basic facts about human cognition and development, and so make reading more difficult than it should be. they inadvertently place many children at risk for reading failure. And that's where my experience at Windward comes in. And I'm going to tell you about what we do at Windward. And I'm going to go through these rather quickly, so bear with me. Oh, that's me. The start at the left is me as a superintendent. And then when I had 10 years experience, I started to break free just a little bit. And that elated person at the end is me right now sitting before you, having the opportunity to go through the Windward program and learn from experts in the field, including my colleague, Dr. Powers. So you've seen some of this before. I'm going to give a slightly different perspective on this. So I'm going to start off with the PISA. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's the program that measures, I think it's 15-year-olds, yeah, 15-year-old performance in industrial and semi-industrial nations across the country. You can see that in the latest PISA data, this is from 2018, we ranked 25th on a composite score, and this is for reading, math, and science together. I can tell you this, if you don't believe in the science of reading, if you don't care about kids, if you're die-in-the-wool capitalist, not a humanitarian, but a die-in-the-wool capitalist, and all you care about is we have to be number one economically, that's what matters, this has got to set you on fire because we're not going to be number one if we're 15th in the world in those areas. And that has not changed. That's my full range of technical ability, that little thing you just saw. How do you go back with this thing? So if we tease out reading from the PISA scores, you can see the United States is 15th in reading in the latest PISA. Again, we can make excuses about this. We can say countries like Finland have a shallow orthography. They're homogeneous. They're not dealing with English language learners. There's a homogeneous population. We're so diverse as a country. All that, okay. But the fact of the matter is we're 13th, and that doesn't change. So let's dig a little bit deeper. You've already seen these. So I'm not 15th in the world to 14th or 13th, or God forbid we should aspire to be number one. I need this. So again, if you look, this is New York State. We've already seen this data. There might be a COVID effect here. I don't think so, too much of a COVID slide, but you can see we've been maintaining our poor performance. And keep in mind, this is the percentage of kids who are below proficient in New York State. This is all children, not just kids with language-based learning disabilities. And 8th grade, the same. We're absolutely dead in the water, 68% from 1998 to 2022. And what I didn't overlay, which I'm sure the Education Trust has already looked at, and I hope our legislators have looked at and our state education officials have looked at, how much money have we spent in that period of time, 24 years, and no progress? Okay. So, if I can get this thing to work. I'm not going to go into this in any more greater detail than that, but I taught math, so I love this stuff, but I'm very conscious that not everybody shares my passion. So I'm going to move right to the science of reading when it's in practice at the Windward School. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Windward. So we're an independent school exclusively for students with dyslexia. In order to get into Windward, you have to have a diagnosis of dyslexia. Not by us, but by an independent practitioner. Here at Windward, our inside line is, unlike any other independent school in the world, in order to get into Windward, you have to fail the entrance exam, and then when you start doing well, we ask you to leave. And we do that. When I first got to Windward, I brought a group of my former colleagues, superintendents in Westchester County, to the school. And I showed them what I'm about to show you. And they looked at me with this kind of smug superintendent look, which I have mastered, by the way. And they went, yeah, but you get to decide who comes to Windward. At public schools, we have to take every child who comes to our door. I said, the children that are coming to our door are the children you couldn't educate. So what I'm going to share with you are kids who have struggled at best or failed miserably, more likely, at their other schools. So the school is nationally recognized for its instructional program. We've been using the science of reading for over 40 years. And we've refined it over those 40 years and made connections, but we've been doing it for a long time. One of the things that I really want to emphasize here is the move from whatever program, balanced literacy, got to do that when you say balanced literacy, whole language, 2 of these, to the science of reading is not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick. It's going to be work. We provide extensive professional development to our teachers. In fact, at Windward, we use a medical model that's based on a residency principle. If you came to us and applied for a job as a teacher, and you had a master's degree in special education, you taught 5 years at the XYZ school, you don't get to teach your first 2 years at Windward, well, at least 1 year. First year, you are a resident, teacher in resident, where you are shadowing a master teacher for a year and taking courses on structured literacy and on language and orthography and on writing, importantly. The curriculum itself is research-based. It happens to be an Orton-Gillingham approach. And we do that because we follow principles that have been documented by the International Dyslexia Association based on lots of research from people that Ben has mentioned, as well as a host of others. I mean, the preponderance of evidence here is breathtaking in terms of support for research-based practices. But this one sentence, I think, summarizes it. Informed, effective classroom instruction, especially in the early grades. This wait till 3rd grade nonsense is deadly for kids. I'm not going to get into that. I don't have enough time to go on that harangue. But you need to do it early. You need to screen and identify, and not just screen and identify. You need to intervene. So, what is effective instruction? You've heard this several times, so I'm not going to go over this. But you can see it's the same things that Ben has spoken about. It's explicit, systematic, we use multi-sensory structure. That's our program. There's not one program, as Ben has emphasized, and others. It's several different, it could be many different programs, but all of them based on the science of reading. Morphology, orthography, phonology, semantics, all of that. All of our teachers need to be experts in language. It's incredible to me as a superintendent how little I knew. Yeah, it's not, right now it's embarrassing when I look back as the educational leader for a school district that was one of the better ones in New York State, allegedly. Well, I shouldn't say allegedly, I think it was pretty good. But the bottom line was I didn't know the stuff I know now, and I should have known then. And I didn't know it because, just like teachers, I wasn't exposed to it. So our effective program provides strategies that emphasize planning, organization, attention to task, critical thinking, and self-management. By the way, I urge you to take, if you are unfamiliar with this, I don't care if you're special ed or general ed, gen ed, go and take a look at IDA's knowledge and practice standards. They're really, I think, tremendously informative. Again, we already know this, and this is important. If you don't know statistics, effect size basically measures the power of an intervention. So effect sizes of 0.5 or more are considered powerful effect sizes. And I'm going to use that in a second. So this is the Orton-Gillingham, where we teach reading, spelling, and we teach handwriting, by the way. The idea that handwriting is done is not true. It's important. We find it really helps kids make the connection with linking the physical motion and the orthographic representation of a letter. And we teach both manuscript and cursive. So we use the structure, we said that already. Visual, auditory, and kinesthetic modalities are taught simultaneously. And decoding, word lists, phrases. For our students, it is so important to have repetition of what was taught. So and parents are involved in this, much to their delight. They get to review the word lists we start out with individual words, then we go to phrases, and then we go to sentences, and then we go to connected text. And that progression works for our kids. So this is the part I really wanted to get to. So forgive me for glossing over that material so quickly, but I think it's been covered by others. So again, here's my W. Edward Demings. It was an American industrialist. He had the idea that quality control really matters. He worked, again, this is another lesson in how American society integrates knowledge into practice. He went to all of the big automotive manufacturers and said, look, what they used to do when cars came off the assembly line, somebody got in it and took it for a test drive. And they said, oh, this doesn't work. And he had the brilliant idea of, wait a minute, if everybody in each step of the assembly line is responsible for quality control, we can find out things that are wrong before we invest all that time and money and it rolls off. He brought that to our auto manufacturers. They said, no, we like quite nicely the way we're doing it right now. So guess where he went? Japan. And guess what happened? Japan cleaned our clocks in automotive sales and manufacturing and reliability for years. That since has changed. And there's my other friend, Mr. Data from Star Trek. So if you're not a Trekkie, you wouldn't recognize him. Okay, so while I was head of school at Windward, we tested children on entrance, pre-intervention, and we used the Iowa test or the Stanford test. And I'm only going to share the data for the reading portion of it, and it's of two parts. It's vocabulary and reading comprehension. During that time, 1,949 students left Windward between 2005 and 2019. Students come to Windward at any grade level, from grades 1 through 8, and they can leave at any grade level. Obviously, they can't leave at first grade, but they can leave at a very handful will leave at second grade, but they'll leave at various grades throughout their tenure. We test them in May of each year on the Stanford. And what we did was we took their beginning pre-intervention score and compared that to the exit score, the year that they were leaving. So pre, post, certain amount of time at Windward. The average stay at Windward is 4.5 years. So this is what happens. So this is the entrance data for the cohorts from 1,949 kids. We didn't cherry pick the data. I'm from Brooklyn, and I would be suspicious if I saw this immediately. I say, whoa, wait a minute. But if you look at this, one other thing I forgot to tell you, the caveat here. In order to be in Windward, you not only have to have a diagnosis, you have to be of average to above average intelligence. You have to be, so we're not having, this does not include kids that every public school has who are below average on the intelligence scale. So if you look at it, this is not an average distribution. You can see it's skewed to the low end with very few students scoring in the upper ends and most of the students scoring in the low end. Now, what's important to know is that if you're not above the 23rd percentile on these tests by third grade, your chances of graduating from high school are tremendously reduced. And Jeff already shared with you the terrible outcomes when you don't graduate from high school. Windward also believes that learning to read is a civil right, and we feel very strongly about that. So these kids have been, in my estimation, not just undereducated, but miseducated. So what happens when they leave? So you can see that the mountain has shifted to the right. And the students now, very few of them, and I'm going to give you numerical representation if you're not a visual learner. Try to practice what I preach. If we were at Windward, I'd have you get up and we do something physical. But what you can see here is that the number of students who are below that, below average, and that is 33.9 percentile, those students have been reduced tremendously. And the students in the average range have moved to the right and are now in the high average range. And we have a significant increase in students who are above average. And for those of you who are more numerically inclined, when students got to Windward, you can see only 8%, and don't forget that the intelligence piece, such as maybe a dubious measure to some, but it is a measure, 8% were above average on this vocabulary portion of the test. When they left, it is 30%. More importantly to me, 96% of the kids had vocabulary in 4.5 years on average that is now average or above average. 96%. These are the same kids who were failing miserably in their former schools. Similar results in reading comprehension. You can see here how the distribution is. There's a definite skew to the left here in the below average and average range. And then when they leave, the mountain moves to the right. And again, for those of you who are numerically inclined, interestingly enough, but not really surprising, 96% have comprehension skills that are average to above average. And significantly, again, we went from 8% above average to 29% above average. So my conclusion before thanking everybody at Yale, where the Global Literacy Hub is located, and the Windward School, and my colleagues here. I've had the pleasure of work with Jason also in New York City. If Windward can do it, any school can do it. However, and this is an important however, we can't go back and blame teachers, blame superintendents, or anybody else. We're past blame. What we need to focus on is solutions. And I believe firmly that the solutions lie in college and universities' preparation of teachers. We, last year at Windward, devoted 11,000 hours to teacher professional development. That's important. We have to provide professional development because just teachers can overcome the deficits that they encountered in their pre-service education, but only if the professional development is based on evidence-based practices and research. I think that we need to have support from groups and agencies that are advocates, like Education Trust. We need to have colleges and universities. I applaud Columbia, begrudgingly perhaps, years, which was based on a bankrupt, proven system of educating how to teach kids. Jean Charles wrote a book in 1967 and published in 1970. It settled the argument in 1970, just like Louis. Do not discredit kids or adults with dyslexia as in any way being less able. They just need to be taught a certain way. Intelligence is not related to dyslexia. It's the notion that dyslexics are somehow compromised in terms of intelligence is just not true. It's a passion of mine because my daughter, when she was in 3rd grade, a psychologist told my wife, I was not present at the meeting, or I wouldn't be sitting before you now. You're not allowed to be a convicted felon and have a teaching license. 3rd grade, told my wife, have you thought about beautician school for your daughter? low expectations. And not that there's anything wrong with being a beautician, but when you're third grade, for God's sakes, give them a chance to prove themselves. So give our dyslexics a chance, give our teachers a chance, give our school systems a chance, and let's work together and get this problem solved. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Russell. So last but not least, we have Jason Borges. Jason is the Executive Director of the New York City Public Schools Literacy Collaborative and is responsible for developing environments where all students learn the necessary literacy skills. He began teaching in alternative schools in Massachusetts that serve students with disabilities and has served as Senior Director of Intensive Interventions and Academic Intervention Services at the Office of Curriculum, Instruction, and Professional Learning at the New York City Department of Education. Mr. Borges is chiefly responsible for the rollout of an entirely new science-based literary instructional model for all New York City public schools this fall. So Jason is in it. He's an early adopter. So Jason, tell us a little bit about New York City to make these changes and some of the early, quick wins and challenges that you're seeing as this overhaul comes into being.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. And first, I just want to say thank you, everybody, and thank you for the Rockefeller Institute for having us, convening all of us here together for this timely and important discussion. It is a moment. It's a national discussion and obviously a local discussion here in New York and in New York City. So we're going to go right to questions, Jeff? Or should I just go right into? Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, I think some of the things I'll address through the presentation. So you may our mayor and chancellor announced back in May 9th. I'm joined here with some members of our team from the Literacy Collaborative, and we've been working tirelessly with a lot of also personal sacrifice, and I want to commend them for all their efforts beginning last February, as well as last year. We're going to sum up here about talking about, right? We are the largest school district in the country, check, but of knowledge, which is actually has science, are going to be big hot topics that we're going to be learning about as we're taking this effort on in New York City public schools. I also want to clarify our office, the public school literacy collaborative. It was formerly the Department of Literacy and Academic Intervention Services. So we're comprised of, as well as an academic intervention services team as well. So let's dig into the rationale and research NYC reads. And this is our why. I'm not going to go through each breakdown here of the numbers, but please read because they will resonate. It's an equity issue. It's been historic. It's been persistent. Pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, it's always been there. And this is something that we are all anchoring into the fact that we have such a vast, rich, diverse communities across the city, as well as our students. And as we could see here, there's large, disproportionate proficiency rates, particularly with our Black and brown population. And then I also want you to pay attention to that last row at the bottom, and that's our college readiness rate through CUNY, some data we recently were able to get a hold of. And what you see there is that with certain subgroups of students is that they have to take remedial coursework in college. And that's because they received non-science-based instruction in our schools. And that's something that we need to course correct, and it's going to take time. And that we know early on as well that there's key indicators, not only for reading difficulties, but are also tied to college and career readiness as well. So again, this is our why for taking all of this on. And so we start with curriculum. Over the past couple of years, we were able to survey what schools were using. Most of it was not evidence-based in terms of instructional materials. There was even instances of schools that were, kind of building their own, designing their own curriculum, and I can only imagine, I remember actually doing this as a teacher years ago, how much time and effort it took to try to design curriculum and implement curriculum, and then also try to address the unique needs of the students in front of me. So not only that, but actually we took samples from across the city of schools, and we found that there were many instances where the assignments and tasks that students were provided with were not aligned to standards as well. So again, we were below the benchmark there. So what we decided to do is to address the issue of curriculum just in K-5 right now at the moment over the next couple of years, which I'll get into. But a couple years ago, we started to focus on foundational skills. Mayor came out and the Chancellor were like, we need to have foundational skills curriculum, approved foundational skills curricula in grades K through 2. We've actually started an institute that support in grades 3 right now. But what we found was, prior to school year 2022-23, is that a lot of schools were using non-systematic ways of teaching foundational skills, and often it was implicit. So a lot of this would arise out of conferences with students. Some of it was also relying strategies, those compensatory strategies that were alluded to by Ben earlier in the discussion, to ensure that we have a mastery-based foundational skills curriculum. So that means that you're not going to hit, say, a pattern, a phonics pattern, and then leave it, and then maybe cycle back to it later, or just leave it behind as a skill that happens in 1 week or in one instance. But we want to ensure that we have a curriculum that's going to provide multiple opportunities for students to be able to be coached through and then be able to independently practice, right? So we want to ensure that they have success at that moment that we release them to independent practice. So foundational skills have been something we've been doing for the past year and a half, and it's still a work in progress, and we still need to be able to support our teachers with the science, with some of the things that were mentioned that they did not receive in pre-service education if they're a recent graduate from a local institution, or if we have a lot of teachers that have been doing certain practices for a very long time. So the change management's real. And we need to support our teachers with getting the relevant schema around the science, as well as support in the application and practice. When we think about the reading and writing practices prior to 2023-24, skills were at the center of the curriculum. So if you look at some balanced literacy curricula that have been out there, is that oftentimes, and I remember this back in the aughts, I did this as a teacher for 2 years, and then I didn't. What would happen is you would model a strategy with a text, and then you would have the students go off and independently practice that strategy out of a text that they selected out of bins within a classroom collection. As a teacher, that is enormously difficult, but then also that lack of not having cross within an elementary school, as well as horizontally across grade teams, different practices happening, a lot of pulling things off the internet, things of that nature. And small group instruction was based on levels of text, and some of those things that I mentioned before, that if you took a 4th grader, sometimes you would see those 4th graders reading texts that were on a 2nd grade level and not being accelerated, nor having targeted skills explicitly taught to them within texts as well. So some of the shifts that we're going to be making that I'm going to allude to in a moment are the things that we're really anchoring into with our districts and our teachers starting this year. So we're moving towards, which is a hot topic right now, is having knowledge-based curriculum, having curricula that is centered with modules, with units of inquiry, having text sets that allow students to be able to engage and build knowledge around those lines of inquiry, in small group instruction, as well as the whole class texts that are being used. Another thing is that, we've mentioned vocabulary before. Vocabulary is a big bang for our buck. And a lot of our students need to not only develop more academic vocabulary and some of the things that Ben was alluding to, particularly in terms of morphology and such, and some of those Latin and Greek derivatives that we find in content later on, that we really need to elevate academic vocabulary, classroom discourse early on, even during read alouds, peer-mediated learning experiences. This all has science and research behind it. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater there, but that is a when. When do you have those experiences? Because there's no either or, it's always a when. When do we need to teach explicitly, and so forth. But we know that, and we know through other states' efforts as well, is that schools need that curriculum. They need to have a common platform that they're going to be operating from. It should have research-backed practices or embedded within the curriculum to support what's enacted for students and some clear guidance around that. But also, we have a transient population in New York City. So if I'm a student that's coming from District 9 in the Bronx, and I'm going to District 23 in Brooklyn, which happens often, if we have completely different types of pedagogy happening or disjointed curriculum, that also impacts our students as well. So that was our decisions to start with, let's get curriculum in place, and let's make sure that, that they're high quality. So here's the 6 shifts. So this slide's powerful because what we did, we were able to identify what are those common practices that were there and what are we moving towards. And this is towards our horizon. And I have to say, through the work with our team and our districts and teachers, even starting as we introduced this earlier in the summer, it really is serving as an anchor in allowing teachers and schools to start focusing in on areas and also to wonder. And a big need that we're seeing is that we need to capture, and we're working on this now, we need to capture teachers doing this because they're already out there, and other teachers need to see it. Principals need to see it. So we're working with the knowledge management team to be able to document and get onto different media that we have to use in professional learning across districts and within our schools. But let's start with the top. So I already mentioned the incidental phonics instruction, the leveled texts, the leveled reading groups. And I want to focus here on the use of decodable text, particularly in K1. That whole idea of kids having independent practice, that is only when they've worked from being a novice to actually being able to demonstrate through independent practice, because we know, and this is the social emotional aspect, is that when students don't have success in that independent practice, it not only takes away from them having achievement, but it also motivation as an outcome. And we want motivation, so it's going to be through the practice. So we need to have decodable text tied to what's within the foundational skills curriculum, so students are experiencing fluency within them, and we've got to coach our teachers into knowing when to pull those decodables away, right, and then start to get more into the literature as well as the content or disciplinary texts that are within the curriculum as well. The targeted small group instruction, we've got to get our teachers to think more diagnostically and prescriptively from the different assessments that we're using. And once they can get the diagnostic and prescriptive, right, knowing what to teach and then how to teach it, then those targeted small groups will be dynamic and fluid and targeted, so that students can move and succeed versus what was done previously. I'll touch upon the universal screening and the formative assessments in a moment. And then lastly, like we mentioned, is the reading curriculum. But those are our big 6 shifts. So what we're doing right now is we're taking a phased approach in the next 2 years. So currently we have 32 K through 8 community districts across New York City, 10 high school districts. I think it's 10. 11. Thanks, Jenna. So the 32 districts, so we're starting with 15 this year. The 15 districts that are taking on already have a high adoption rate in approved curriculum. So they're already they're implementing right now. The training started last spring, summer, and now they're in implementation. Going into school year 24-25 will be the remaining 17 K-8 districts for K-5. Oh, I just want to go back one moment. I do this, right? Yep. I also want to mention here too is that what's happening is that all of the schools in phase 1, those 15 districts, they are getting job embedded coaching. So there's coaches that are coming in, supporting them with doing the curriculum. You have to do the curriculum to learn the curriculum, and then know what are those kinds of supports that are needed, because no curriculum is perfect, but thinking about what are the different kinds of scaffolds that are going to be needed to be able to support the unique needs and differentiate for students. So that's the support they're getting this year, as well as continued for those phase 2 districts moving into next year as well. There you go. So another part of our effort, right? So the curriculum, if you think about, how many of you know MTSS, or our response to intervention? It's that universal instruction. We have a core curriculum problem and instruction problem, right? So when we take a school that has kind of an upside down triangle, right, where a lot of students need acceleration, right, because then what we need to be able to do, we have to focus our efforts on that core instruction. However, we also know, and Jay was alluding to it before, is that we have a population of students, and the research backs this, that are going to need 30 times more practice and skills and foundational skills to be able to develop fluency. So our academic intervention services team is following the phased approach, and I'll go into some level of detail in a moment, in the remaining minutes, where we're placing central support to do intensive intervention for those kids that are going to need this level of instruction. So we're going into our 3rd year in New York City, where every single school universally screens 3 times a year. And from a systems perspective, whether you're a principal or you're a district administrator, screeners are important because they give you a sense of the health of instruction within your district as well as within your school as a principal. For teachers, it allows us to see which students in our class are going to need some extra supplemental support, as well as which students are on track to meet the important reading outcomes at a given grade, and which students are going to need the intensive supports that I was mentioning earlier. But universal screening they're quick, easy, efficient assessments. In K2, we have assessments that target early reading skills. And I'll go back, sorry. They are production-based tasks. So they, phonemic awareness, we have phonemic segmentation, letter naming fluency early on in kindergarten. And then we start to get into decoding and fluency and first and comprehension into 2nd grade. So it follows a developmental continuum in those grades, but they're predictive in nature. So we're able to identify as early as middle to end of kindergarten which kids are presenting a degree of risk and that they're going to need support. So when we think of that K through 2 and the screeners help us, it's preventative in nature. We want to prevent those negative reading outcomes from occurring, and we want to focus our efforts and to train up our teachers to be able to not only do that Tier 1 curriculum that's happening, particularly in foundational skills, but we also want to build in those supplemental supports in those grades, because we know from the research as well is that the earlier we do it, the easier it is to catch kids up. We have some at-risk gated screening that's happening, particularly in grades 3 through 5 in these phase 1 schools. And what we did was we established a cut risk point of the 16th percentile below the mean, the proficiency, the lowest okay. And those are the pool of kids that we want to be able to do some oral reading fluency measures with in those grades, so we can identify, is this an individual accuracy issue, i.e. decoding? Is this a rate issue, fluency, or is it both? And that's going to allow us, again, to be able to target the interventions more appropriately. Yeah, I'll mention some of the pilot work that happened last year too, but this slide really just encapsulates all students universally screened. Number 2, we look for those students that gated screening can get what they need in 9th grade to help support them and accelerate their reading as well as writing, which we haven't spoken about. So that is underway. We've got some pilot sites as well that we have in the works for this year, so that we can further learn what the needs are and where the successes are and elevate those. But we're really excited that we're going to be moving forward with supporting our secondary students going into next year as well. So, all right, I know I'm at time. So I just want to conclude by saying thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, just a timely, important discussion. And just to kind of give you a little bit of a sense, pretty high level of what's going on in New York City right now, as this journey just began. So thank you. Down.
So I'm going to stand up because I've been sitting a while. Feel free to stretch your legs. But we want to open it up for questions. I do have just a couple quick takeaways and kind of a what's next, but I'm going to be quick because I know you've heard a lot of information. So I appreciate y'all being such a great, patient audience. So just a couple takeaways and sort of what's next. So I think it's clear as you listen to the panelists and as you read the news and as we listen to folks across the state that this is a movement. It's happening. It's already happened across the country. It's coming in New York. We're at the earlier stages, but it is happening. I think it's also clear we know what to do, right? So as I said earlier, we're past the point of reports and frankly, some of these discussions, we know we need to have action, both at the local level and at the state level. So I think that's a next step. Another thing that came up and I think is important is this need to bring people along, right? There's a lot of folks that have been, as others have said, that may not have followed not out of, a desire to punish kids, but out of a desire, particularly if they weren't trained. And so I think bring people along in this movement and not resist that urge for blame, which I know happen. And like I said, we know what to do. We can't wait anymore. Time is now. We're going to the next few weeks. We're going to invite to folks, so you can get contact info. Please reach out if you're interested in that. With that, I want to open it up for questions. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, this was great, excellent. Thank you for doing this. A couple questions. So the first question is really about maybe the other side of blame. We are clear about we need to move to science of reading. We need to move with all deliberate speed. How do we make sure that we're also taking a look at how we got here, so that you set up the guardrails and the protections to make sure, right, we end up right back here. So that, if anyone wants to answer the question, sort of, what's that process? What are the things that we should be considering, making sure the lessons learned, right, are lessons learned and we don't repeat? How did we get here? And then the second part of that is then how do we make sure that reading, this way we think about implementing these practices and policies, making sure that we are not setting up again, right, and falling into the trap of this is the thing, this will be the thing, and not being able to see when it's not the thing.
Great, thank you. Our panelists want to jump at that one?
I don't mind jumping in. I think that I think it begins with a multiple-tiered approach. I think we need leadership in terms of legislation. I know just a simple example that there's been a bill that in the legislature for task force on dyslexia that has their example. So I think that's one. the Board of Regents, under the leadership of the Chancellor and the Commissioner, have a bully pulpit to move the agenda along, and I think they have, and hopefully will continue. But colleges and universities must do their part. Our teachers come in, and I use this word cautiously, but I've been doing this wrong. That's a bitter pill to swallow that most people actually are going to put up a barrier, and it can't be approached that way. We have to find ways of introducing this as cognitive science, finally breaking the barrier through what Ben mentioned, and which I believe in firmly, and which Hub and our partners at universities fully engaged in, as translational science. Mm-hmm. No, it's not blame. We're going to take this information, this knowledge base, and we're going to translate it and have with you as an equal partner. It's got to be a duality there, back and forth, a dynamic. We have to set up structures that will engage teachers in research, and that's the tricky part. And Ben mentioned this last thing is we can't have silos in universities. Psychology department, science, the neuroscience are working in their silos, and the schools of education are working in their silos, and never the twain shall. Can't be. So those are a couple of ideas.
Just add prepare to teach kids. We ask them to go through a process, undergraduate, graduate degree. In New York State, you need to get continuing ed. We just haven't been giving the right thing, but teachers as professionals, number one. And I think if we can make that shift, then we can start to be able to gatekeep the things that you're referencing. Part of that, though, is thinking about the standards that underlie what it means to be a professional. And I think, like Jay talked about, in terms of a medical model, what's the expectation for what types of things we need to be making sure that teachers have in front of them with with their background pre-service, but then also with their professional development. Big piece of that to me is being informed consumers of research. We are asking teachers to be able, today we ask teachers to look at resources like Teachers Pay Teachers, which is I think right now like the #1 resource for non-curricular approved resources for teachers in the United States. Teachers aren't trained to be informed consumers of research. And so exactly what Jay was just highlighting, we need to do that. We need to have that as part of schools of ed, because then, it's not going to, nothing's going to guarantee it, but the best gatekeeper to make sure. And I think
I was going to ask that great question, and I'm not 100% sure that you talked about guardrails, you talked about teaching teachers, but you didn't talk about the other part of it, which I don't know if any of us like to really discuss, which is testing. How do you test without testing, and how do you actually make sure not just that the guardrails are in place for teachers, but that it's working? We don't want to be here 24 years having the same conversation because we all thought this was the next pill to the best pill to swallow. And in fact, about legislation, obviously, what legislation really is needed, or is it really a question of implementation at the regents level and how that gets pulled out? But then, what about our kids who English is a second language, and there's so many students, and I'm looking around and I don't see a lot of people of color in this room. I didn't see a lot of people of color or people who maybe have Spanish as a first language or another language that are involved in this conversation, and I'd like to know how the science of reading does address some of those issues, if at all. And that's just some of my questions, so I'll start with that.
You want to take a in there? Maybe I'll just on the legislative question, because that's something that we're focused on. And so we're looking for really comprehensive legislation, right? That's going to include something around curriculum. Again, there's a lot of different ways. States have mandated it. Again, New York state, so there are ways to incentivize districts, to provide grants to districts, particularly if they're using let's say Lucy Calkins, they want to replace that with an evidence-based curriculum. With that said, I think, the question of kind of what can state ed do or what can the regions do, everything we've heard is that we can't force districts to do certain things. And my sense, the approach has been to push out guidance, which is great, but there's no guarantee that districts are going to follow that guidance. In fact, some of the guidance has been out the outcomes that we're seeing. So my sense is there needs to be a state legislative piece in here, right? A bit more that's going to that urgency that we're talking about. And so we've got a lot of details on that, and we're talking with folks who'd love to talk more. But I think there's got to be legislative push, and that could come from the governor, it could come from the legislature. Something's got to happen that gets us closer to that urgency.
Ben and I and colleagues that we emphasized was the possibility of changing certification. That's something insist on having a component on certification that requires knowledge of practice, knowledge and skills in terms of science of reading. And that's a very concrete step that other states have undertaken that. So that's a specific example. I know you wanted to add something, Jason.
Yeah, to the multilingual learner question, and also thinking about the evidence base to support our multilingual learners. I mean, first and foremost, just thinking about assessment, right? There are assessments that we are still piloting right now, thinking about screening, that do both Spanish and English. We need to understand what students, so these things do translate, to support, no pun intended, but to support our multilingual learners.
I'll just add really quickly, I mean, as far as our focus is primarily students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, they've been most impacted in a negative way by what we've talked about and stand to benefit the most. It drives our work. I think it drives everybody's work. But Rachel, do you want me to pick?
Thanks to all of you for your presentations, Jeff, and to you and your team for hosting this with Rockefeller. Within the legislation, I was on the team, for example, that brought for that. For that, I think we're missing a critical piece. I'm not sure how many principals are in the room. Myself and Mr. Soler, who was here before. If this is going to happen, legislation can tell us, generally speaking, in New York, what we have to do. No one is coming in to make sure that we're actually doing it with the intentionality of the design, right? That's where we really risk those in implementation. Staff districts, undertrained principals, superintendents who don't see the value in this work, just keep doing what risk. There is a legislative component to this, I do believe. And Jay, I think you're absolutely right. Pull the levers that we know work. But if we think that a law is going to change what's happening in our classroom, I can tell you with evidence it doesn't happen that way. I can tell you what does happen is that the leaders of the building, the leaders of the district, get smart quickly around this work, and they lead the work with work is here from the council superintendents. Absolutely thrilled. That organization for principals has to get involved in this.
So thank you. I have a sort of a question. One of the things that I find, and I have a bill for this, and that is in higher education, making sure that the 6 credits of literacy that are mandated to teach methods of teaching reading, like science, always fail to do that, but it was the same thing with universal screening. Nobody wants to tackle it. They don't want to mandate. The thing is, besides the cross stuff, and I loved Jean, and that is that not only do we not have, you know, an intersection example. I was a teacher of the deaf, so I'm a language person, you know. But is that even in New York, within education, we have a silo between K through 12 teachers. If you're K through 5, you'll learn about reading, but not about how to. Don't really have anything to do with K to 5. We have the curriculum people who don't have anything to do with any of them. So even within education, our field, we've totally bifurcated you know, early instruction from the teaching, and we've been you know, prepping our teachers of reading in a methodology, an approach, a belief that isn't in fact accurate according to the science. But the other thing I have, I'm sorry, and I'm going to ask Jason this question. You talked about looking at signs of risk at below the 16th percentile, and one of the things I have is worked with a lot of clinicians, and of course that's design kinds of things, and finding, you know,
X, right? Like that should be the starting to start to investigate and the interventions for those kids if they're above the 16th percentile. But what we're trying to do is, in terms of like the risk status, is find students that are presenting more of a true positive, some of that 5 to 10% Jay was mentioning. We need to narrow down that pool, and that's going to happen through the cyclical process of doing the intensive intervention as well. Regardless if a kid has an IEP or, but it is an ongoing. It's a down with special ed, but yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be addressed for those very reasons.
Hi, Keith Newvine from the largest teachers education comprehensive school in the SUNY system. I've heard an awful lot about teacher educators not preparing teachers to teach reading. But my school failed the NCTQ. I teach elementary literacy methods courses to SUNY elementary teachers. I teach the science of reading. I'm telling you right now. I was schooled in the science of reading at Syracuse University, got all 3 of my degrees. Some of the scholars. So, of teacher educators, because I'm to AT, blame me for the teachers not being able to teach reading. That's one. 2, in response to the guardrails, there's lots of research out there, article out there about Orton Gillingham and how effective or ineffective it is. So I encourage you to read that meta-analysis. I encourage you to read the articles research in regards to letters training and how effective it is on actual student learning for literacy, because the guardrails are follow some programs and implement them, even though right now we already know that the ones you're about to swallow are educators, because there's a lot of them in the room, and being aware of wholesale adoption of curriculum, because that's how it gets implemented in K-12. It's what curriculum can I purchase to meet the needs, and how can I support teachers in learning it? So decide, Lucy might not be around, but somebody else is going to come in with a curriculum that people are going to adopt. You're being forced to adopt one of 3 in New York City. These are some considerations for the panelists. If you really want to bring people along in this conversation, largely the people who are educating the teachers, who you're not blaming, then maybe we want to pull back some of the rhetoric that we've heard today, because it is a bit problematic. And maybe we want to consider the adoption of these things as research programs that are inevitably going to be adopted, what the research says about those programs right now.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And as I said earlier, I think we do absolutely want to avoid that villainization. We can do, I think, and I'll do a better job of that. Anyone want to respond really quickly?
Pre-service teacher instruction. I would want to make sure that we're all clear on is that, at least for pre-service educators in literacy, one of them is selecting children's literature, okay? I would propose that that is not adequate. The biggest job educators have to do in the classroom, K through 5, in my mind, is reading and math. Those are two foundational things we need for kids to be successful and to unlock all content. There are some incredible programs there. I mean, even New Paltz, or I know there are Jay. I know has partnered with New York City, Manhattanville. Colleagues. So, not the individuals teaching teachers. Excellent work being done in that case. It's the totality of what we're providing to teachers. 6 credits is not going to teach a kid to read more of it. So we need more champions like you doing that work out there in pre-service and graduate school of education in this country.
Yeah, I feel strongly about it. And the reality is, of pre-education, it points a very clear finger at universities and colleges who train teachers who have deficits in that training program. It wasn't personal at all. Going from a criticism of a program in general, I don't know where you teach, but in general, to personal criticism is a leap that I certainly didn't intend, but I stand by my statements. Colleges and universities need to do a better job across the board introducing the science of reading to pre-service. And the one thing that I think is a very reliable source of information for that is NCTQ. So I'm basing my comments on the research that they've done in terms of surveying programs across this country.
Thank you so much for today, and thank you to you and all the educators in the room for the work you do every day. I'm Lucy Lang. I'm the State Inspector General and the parent of a brilliant dyslexic 7-year-old. And I've been a teacher in New York's prisons for many years, and as IG have visited classrooms in every prison and every secure juvenile detention facility in the state. So I'm wondering whether any of your organizations or others you know of are working to get the science of reading into our secure residential facilities where so many of our most vulnerable readers find themselves.
That's you.
Yeah, I'll just tell you very quickly. My mentor was a woman named Diana Hanbury King, if you know who she is. And right before she passed away, she started working in the Waterbury prison systems and